I am filming in continuation of my previous vlog. It is still Monday, August 5th as I am recording this. I wanted to give a word count update. It is 12:15 p.m. and I've been writing for about an hour and a half total. I managed to get out 308 words, leaving my manuscript at a grand total of 4,382. I think I'm going to stop here for today, and I'm going to focus the rest of today on catching up with my reading. I mentioned a couple episodes ago that I really wanted to find a better flow with my reading and that I wanted to prioritize that more because that's something I didn't really do in my first iteration of this challenge. And I've since realized that reading is something I need to do more of than actually the writing. It keeps my ideas fresh, and reading is so instrumental to my writing process. I'm thinking about going to the library today and picking up some new books. Might also return my DNFs. Speaking of DNFs, I was thinking of doing a bit of a book talk for this video. Walk you through my DNFs, why I did not finish them, and then also walk you through what I am actually reading. My stack of DNFs, the stack of books I'm currently reading, not including ebooks. I go through seasons of different types of reading methods. I'll either binge read a book from beginning to end, cover to cover, or I'll read a handful of books and a few chapters at a time. I prefer the binge reading method, but I can't always do it, and I can't always fork over the time and dedication to do it. Meet my husband.
Hello.
Let's talk about our future reading plans. We're gonna attempt to read, is it the Similarian?
Yeah, but first I'm doing Harry Potter ASMR style, where I will be whispering and tapping the Harry Potter books. Yes.
So stay tuned for that. But we're gonna read the Similarian together, and we're gonna attempt it in one go.
Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings, Lord.
I love you.
Lord of the lore.
Speaking of binge reading, that is going to happen soon. But when I don't binge read, I go on the completely opposite end of the spectrum and I just read little bits here and there. It's an attention span thing, it's also an interest thing, but it's also that I sometimes just don't want to get stuck in one author's frame of mind for too long, because I find that it can influence my thinking to a higher degree than I would want it to. Okay, so let's start with The Gambler. I love the brothers Karamazov, and that is now my standard for Dostoevsky. My understanding of this book is that it's one of his earlier works before he was imprisoned and then sent to his execution, which was thwarted. And in light of him getting that second chance at life, he really changed as a writer. So Dostoevsky, pre his execution that didn't end up happening and post his execution that didn't end up happening, is a very, very different writer. It's like after that traumatic moment, he completely just opened up to a new level of writing. I haven't read Crime and Punishment yet, but my husband has, and he tells me it's very, very dark, as does everybody else who has read Crime and Punishment. But the common advice is that one should be in a really good headspace before embarking on Crime and Punishment. So I'm saving that for the right time in my life. I don't like to be depressed when I read. I don't like to feel icky when I read. So that said, I am biding my time before I get to Crime and Punishment. But because of Brothers Karamazov, I just could not get into this. I've also read The Idiot by Dostoevsky, I do want to revisit that in another translation. The one my husband and I have at home is by PNV, and I personally do not enjoy PNV's translation as a reader, although my understanding is that in the academic circles, they have quite the high reputation for being really literal translators. But I just don't enjoy reading their translations. They don't glide for me as others do. They don't paint the pictures and the metaphors for me like other translators do. The interesting thing about The Idiot, my first go around of that, I think I got to like 200 or 250 pages or so, I DNF'd, but then my husband insisted I read it through. So I did, and I'm glad I did because I do love the story and the character portrayal. I think there's something incredibly perceptive about the character portrayal in The Idiot. So I do want to read that in another translation. That said, I did enjoy The Idiot for its character portrayals, and for that reason I just couldn't get into The Gambler. Next on my DNF list, Dr. Zhivago. I really tried, but I ended up picking up a book by Ivan Gontarov just to compare the vibe in reading both. Ivan Gontarov is also one of my favorite Russian authors, and even reading a memoir by him, I'm like, I prefer his style so much more. Like, it is like, the difference is here's Gontarov and here's like, you know, Dr. Zhivago. So with that, I DNF'd this one. The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock. I really wanted to love it, but I think I got to like almost a third of the way through, and it just got a little excessive for me. I think the author writes really beautifully, but the themes just weren't of my particular tastes and interests. I also found it really interesting that she wrote in present tense, so the reading experience was very different. It felt lighter, more ethereal, and I appreciated the journey, but the themes I just couldn't really get into. And with a book this large that is actually quite immersive, I was like, I am in danger of being influenced subconsciously by the themes here, and I didn't want to be for how I'm moving along with my manuscript. Next up, The City of Dreaming Books. I also really wanted to love this because it's got really gorgeous and adorable pictures. I love an adult fantasy book with pictures, but I just couldn't get into the story, and I couldn't get into the world of like dinosaurs talking and being literary geniuses. I couldn't really get into it, so I DNF'd that. Other honorable mentions in my DNF list. I tried again to get into Ulysses, but after like 50 pages, reading this in an ebook format, I just couldn't get into it, and I was like, I am DNFing this for good. It's just not my style. I understand that James Joyce is this literary celebrity, but he's just not for me. Last year, I believe, I attempted Finnegan's Wake, and I'm glad I went. I think I got a third of the way through that book. It is a wild book. He basically invented a language, gibberish, to write this whole book, and I think it took him like 10 or 20 years or so to write, some ridiculously long amount of time to write this book, because he was inventing the language while he wrote it. So that book, though, I keep in the back of my mind as something to encourage me when I'm in the pits of my writing feels, because I'm like, if a book like that can be published, I mean, the sky is the limit. I have dabbled in other lighter works of fiction, modern fiction, such as, I think it's like Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and it does seem really interesting, but again, the vibes are not for me, so I DNF that. I generally don't think I gravitate toward modern fiction. So let's talk about the books I am currently reading and I feel like 98% sure I'm gonna finish. Immortal Poems of the English Language. I am so glad I found this at Goodwill. I really had to dig for it because these poems are so beautiful and they are incredibly thought-provoking. There is a reason why they have stood the test of time, and I just love this book already. So I know I'm gonna finish this, but it is a slow read. It's not something I can breeze through in a binge session. I mean, I could, but I feel like I wouldn't enjoy it as much. So this I'm reading, it will stay, and I will absolutely reread. The third book of the Kingdoms, The Way Beneath by Angus Wells. This was also a Goodwill find. I'm about a quarter of the way through with it. I think it is written in very beautiful language. I love how the author writes. I wouldn't say it's the most exciting adventure ever, but it is well written and I appreciate the author's pacing. Also, I've never heard of him before. I just randomly picked up this book. So there is a first and a second book to the trilogy. I stay reading this book to remind myself that fantasy is not the genre I want to be writing in. I appreciate reading it, but writing it is not for me because I mean, just the caliber of writing is I think is really good. And I know that my writing in fantasy will not meet up to this caliber. So I'm gonna stay in my lane of literary fiction and be happy there. Then we have Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. I grew up reading Harry Potter. It has been a childhood staple, formative work in my youth, and I really want to reread the entire collection in my adulthood. So I already read the first and second. I believe it was last year, like December or so, and now I'm getting into the third book, and I kind of toggle between the two. When this gets too heavy, I'll pick this up. When this gets a little too light, I'll pick this up. I just love Harry Potter so much. So there's that. And next we have one of my favorite books. Actually, I have a lot of favorite books, but this is also up there in my favorite books list. The Book of Disquiet by Fernanda Pessoa. My goodness, I don't even really have the words to describe how much I love this book. It has completely opened my mind to a new philosophy of sensationalism rather than emotionalism. What I mean by that is that through Pessoa, I learned the difference between feeling from an emotional standpoint and feeling from a sensational standpoint. That sensational feeling is more of that experiential vibe manner of living and being and existing, whereas the emotional type of feeling is more of like sad, happy, etc. The emotional feeling is more of the standard idea of what we attribute to feelings. Love Pessoa. And this is a collection of, I don't even know if it's short stories per se, but he writes poetically, and he is the author who introduced me to poetic prose. It is completely mind-blowing to read Pessoa, and it's definitely more of a meditative, contemplative work. So also slow read. I think I've been reading this all year. Like I think I started this in January, maybe February. I think it was maybe even before January actually. I've been reading this for a while and it goes slow, but it is incredible. Next up on my currently reading list, An Uncommon Story by Ivan Goncharov. I referenced this as I was talking about Dr. Zhivago, and this is a memoir, but I love Goncharov. I read Oblomov by him, and that's also one of my favorite books. I really think Goncharov has a high level of perceptivity. So he's very precise in his thinking, and so it's a high level of clarity that I think he possesses as a writer. So in terms of how he looks at the world, he has really interesting insights, much like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Tolstoy, though, reads a little bit slower compared to Goncharov, and Goncharov writes a little bit more cozier, but he's still got that sharp perspective. Dostoevsky is a lot more fugue, torrent-like, a lot more chaotic, but it still makes sense. That's Dostoevsky in comparison to Goncharov and Tolstoy. On the note of Russian authors, I think Goncharov is so underrated compared to Ivan Turgenev. Personally, I'm not really a fan of Turgenev, and actually this book is his beef with Turgenev. And Goncharov accuses Turgenev of plagiarizing from him, and I fully believe it. People say that this is exemplary of writer's paranoia, and while I can see that, and also I'm almost a third of the way through, so I don't really know the full extent of Goncharov's mental decline, which apparently gets progressively worse, so I don't really know that yet. But in terms of how he even, what's the word I'm looking for, roasts Turgenev, I mean, I agree. I agree with him. I think Turgenev became famous a lot because of his own societal influence. Like, he was definitely a social butterfly. And according to Goncharov, I mean, he was a good-looking dude. He, was really popular. And so I think he became famous more by popularity with the people than purely by merit as a writer. And I do think that Goncharov is a better writer, in my preference, than Turgenev. Turgenev does a great job of telling more broad, sweeping stories in a condensed and concise manner. And I would say Goncharov is definitely more detail-oriented, and I prefer that. However, if you're not someone who enjoys lengthier works or long form, then probably Turgenev is better for you because he is more concise. But I am discursive. I like long-winded descriptions that are like really heavy with the metaphors and insights. So my vote is for Goncharov. We have now George Louis Borges, Collected Fictions. You just have to read him. He has so much style in writing, magical realism. If you love Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I think you'll love Borges. He writes, I think these are short stories. Yeah, these are short stories. And they're very, very interesting. How he writes also is very poetic. You just have to read Borges. I have read his nonfiction collection as well, and those are also really interesting, but he goes more into literary criticisms in that volume, and I'm not really interested in literary criticism, so the Collected Fictions is really interesting. I love Borges. Speaking of Tolstoy, I have Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy, or Count Lev Tolstoy. That's not even his full name. I have this much left. I have been slowly reading this. I think Tolstoy is a slower read for sure, but I love the way Tolstoy writes. I love how he presents his ideas, and yeah, I'm almost through with Resurrection. I love Anna Karenina, and I have War and Peace in my TBR list coming soon. And I don't enjoy this as much as Anna Karenina just because of the themes. He explores more of like the prison systems in Russia in this book, and he presents them well, but it's not personally my preference in terms of what I like to read about. But other than that, I mean, it's Tolstoy. He writes so well. I specifically go for the Aylmer, I don't know how to say his name right, Aylmer and Louise Maud translations whenever I go for Tolstoy, just because they're also his preferred translators. They were close friends with Tolstoy. Tolstoy also spoke English, and he chose that couple to represent him as translators for his works. So I prefer the Maud translation for Tolstoy because they had a relationship with him, and they had a strong understanding of his voice and his intention. And I also do think that Aylmer and Louise Maud, they write well. Resurrection was just translated by Louise. I believe Aylmer had passed by that point. I think he started it with her and then he passed, but don't quote me on that. And finally, for the physical books I'm currently reading, I've been reading Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. I am about halfway through. This is also a slow read for me. I began reading this because I was trying to write a hostage scene in my first iteration of my manuscript, which completely got changed when I switched over to literary fiction. And I wanted to write a realistic hostage scene in terms of the dialogue. So I picked this up. I actually had it in my collection from like years ago. And I found this again and I read it so that I could get more into the psychology of hostage negotiation. It's interesting and it definitely breaks up the heaviness of everything that I'm reading. Two other books I'm reading in ebook format. Resurrection by Paul Selig. This is an automatically written book. So Paul Selig is a psychic and he channels. He's a channel writer. So I've been reading that and it's definitely more of a spiritual book, but I really enjoy it. It gives me a lot to think about and it helps me reframe life. I'm also reading Castle in the Sky by Diana Wynne Jones. I started reading Howl's Moving Castle last year and I finished that last year, so I wanted to read the second and third this year. Howl's Moving Castle is one of my favorite movies and the book is really feel good and cozy and cute, so I read that just for some lightness. So I enjoyed the first book and now I'm reading the second. I really want to make more space to finish up my books that I'm currently reading because I am so excited for my TBR books. I'll definitely share that in another video. I hope you enjoyed this. I wanted to bring to the booktube other books that are not being talked about that I think are worth the read, that are really philosophically game-changing.